If you're a landlord in Ontario and want to know how to use the N13 form, this video is for you. An N13 is a notice to terminate tenancy because the landlord wants to demolish the rental unit, repair it, or convert it to another use. You give this notice to your tenant, filling out your information, their information, your rental address specifically and accordingly and matching to the lease agreement that you have, followed by the termination date that has to be at least 120 days after the date of service, coinciding with 4 rent cycles in accordance with your lease. The next thing you're going to be doing is you're going to fill out the reasons that you're serving this notice, which we're going to get into a little more detail in a bit. Now, as this form has to do with renovations, repairs, zoning, or redevelopment, you're going to need to describe in some detail the intentions of the work that you're doing such that it will require the unit to be vacant. And after you've described that in enough detail, you're going to move on to shading out the next section, which is the necessary permits section. Now, this section is very important because if this form does end up leading to a hearing, in order to obtain an eviction, you will almost definitely need to have pulled a permit for the work that you're describing, and the work has to be also substantial enough and necessary enough for an adjudicator to actually award you with an eviction. Subsequent to this form, you're going to be filling out an L2 with the LTB and you're going to wait for a hearing date. You are able to file an L2 immediately with this form to enforce an order. You really need to make sure that whatever evidence you're going to be bringing to the table as part of your hearing, such as your permits, you have obtained them before the hearing date so that you arrive prepared. Now, as part of the N13, we're going to talk about compensation and the ability for the tenant to be returning to the unit. Now, something to keep in mind here is that you will have to pay your tenant according to the type of unit you have, and you may need to allow them to move back into the unit if you're selecting reason 2 as part of your N13. Now, there are instructions about this in the form below, but basically you have to pay your tenant at least 3 months rent if you have something that is a 5-plex and over, and 1 month's rent if you have less than 5 units at your rental property. Now, if the tenant has in fact indicated to you that they do wish to move back into the unit after you have completed your renovations, let's say you had to pay them 3 months rent because you have more than 5 units in your building. If your renovations only took 1 month, you only have to pay them for the time that you had to have them out of the unit. So if your renovations took 1 month, you only have to pay them 1 month's rent. Now, this form, although in looking at it, it may actually be relatively simple to fill out, it is actually notably rather difficult to enforce due to the requirements of permits and timeframes. In order to understand this, we're going to need to talk about a few reasons that you're going to be selecting from. So let's get into that right now. Now, we're not actually going to jump into too much detail to discuss reasons 1 and 3 here, but in a nutshell, reason 1 is going to be if you want to demolish a unit or rental complex, and this is often being used if you're a developer or you're a builder. And reason 3, this can be used by someone who's doing a zoning change because you are either ordered by the city due to a bylaw infraction to change the zoning that now is going to be interfering with the residential side of what you're renting, or let's say you have a commercial part of the building that wants to be extended onto the residential section, then you can apply for a zoning change and you can do the drawings and the permits to do this in kind, and you will be able to use this form to ask your tenant to leave. And again, because these are rarely used, we're not going to be talking about them too much, but instead let's talk about reason 2, which is having to do with renovations and extensive repairs such that you need the unit vacant. You're going to set your termination date as indicated in the form, and you're going to have a conversation with your tenant. You pay the tenant in accordance with the form, and they have about 120 days to make their arrangements. And hopefully, if all goes well, they're going to leave in accordance to that termination date. Now, if they don't leave at the time that you set in the termination period and you have to take the matter to the board, you should have reasonable permits pulled and reasonable work that is required to be done such that an adjudicator can make a reasonable decision to grant you a termination, and you will be able to proceed with eviction. Now, notice how I use the word reasonable here a lot because this actually has to be discretionarily decided by the adjudicator, so you have to really think about the reason why you're using this form. You cannot just arbitrarily decide that your unit needs renovations, and you also cannot simply decide that these renovations absolutely need your tenant to be out of the unit for you to complete the work that needs to be done. The work being performed is scrutinized considerably by the board, as some landlords attempt to use this form unethically for all the wrong reasons, doing what a lot of people refer to as renovictions. Something to note here is that even if a renoviction is not your intention, you do not want the evidence that you're putting before an adjudicator to make them think that this might be what you're doing. So it's important that you start to demonstrate what a lot of people will refer to as good faith in your application. Now let's talk about good faith a little bit as it pertains to previous case scenarios. So what we've done here is we've looked at about 15 other cases and some of them were our own and others were of our colleagues, and came to certain conclusions. Certain conclusions that made us believe that some things worked in favor of the application and other things just didn't. Now, I think we've already established that when you're serving an N13, if you want this form to be successfully used, you need to pull permits alongside this application. And if you're pulling permits for something to do with safety, it's a little easier to justify. Like, let's say if you pull something for electrical because you need to replace all the knob and tube in the property for safety reasons, that's a little bit easier to explain. Or let's say you have an old heating system, you need to open up walls to do repairs and replace, and if you need to pull a drywall permit, this can also be easily explained. But now let's say you want to just arbitrarily do cosmetic upgrades that don't really seem entirely necessary, especially if the unit already looks pretty good. An adjudicator may look at this and say, is your intention here good? And good might not even be the right word. I would use reasonable. But now I don't want anyone watching this to get the wrong idea here and think that an adjudicator is looking at you with a disposition that you're trying to pull a fast one over them or anything like that. Their job is to be relatively unbiased in the matter. But with this understanding, we've actually found that a lot of landlords using the N13 have a surprising amount of T5s filed against them, which is a tenant's application against the landlord for filing a notice for termination in bad faith. Again, it always comes down to this idea of good and bad faith in how the landlord is conducting themselves. If a tenant decides to file a T5 against you, they have to have good enough reasons to do so, and you have to have indicated in some fashion or form that there's a possibility that your intentions were not genuine here. But in the T5s that we saw tenants apply for against landlords, it doesn't mean that all of them were successful. But the ones that were successful were often found to be because the landlord either failed to apply for a permit and never did the work, or they never offered the unit back to the tenant if they decided to backpedal and not proceed with the work. Now, on the other hand, the ones that were successfully defended were the ones that the landlord was either able to explain why they didn't proceed with the work, and they demonstrated good faith by showing that they did apply for permits and that they got quotes from contractors and that they even did drawings to show what it was that they were looking to do here. Basically, this was all stuff that showed that there was in fact some degree of intention to proceed with the work. A person's circumstances are in fact allowed to change. It doesn't mean that just because you set out to do something, you have to do it, otherwise you're going to be penalized for not doing it. An adjudicator's job is to look at the reasons that you're presenting as to why you had somebody displaced from their home and then did not proceed with the work. It almost makes it not having been worth it for an adjudicator to have ordered this tenant to leave. So they have to make this right somehow. But if you did your part, and as a landlord, you offered the unit back to the tenant, you can demonstrate to some degree at least that you acted in good faith in order to correct the matter. But now, why, might you ask, would the tenant be filing against the landlord if the landlord offered the unit back to the tenant? Well, in some cases, the work took so long that the tenant found other accommodations and the landlord offered the unit back to the tenant, but the tenant was unable to accept. An adjudicator, in this case, may award the tenant compensation for some damages, but at least you as a landlord are not being penalized for acting in bad faith. Now, to conclude this video and to bring context to when the form should be used, if you want to use the N13, it should generally be used to perform repairs and upgrades deemed somehow necessary, preferably having something to do with safety and permits. You should use this form carefully because it actually happens more often than not that renovations take a long time and then tenants end up finding alternative accommodations because they end up having to wait too long to move back into that unit. And then when you go through the whole song and dance of having the tenant file a T5 against you, you end up paying a lot more in compensation than you may have otherwise had to pay the tenant if you had just offered it to them up front. So that concludes our video, guys, and I hope this helps you understand as a landlord how to use an N13. Everything that we've talked about here has generally to do with our experiences managing roughly 800 tenancies across the greater Hamilton area. So if you're looking for help managing your tenant situation, please do not hesitate to text us, email us, and we'll be sure to get back to you. We'll have some information about us in the description below. In the meantime, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel if you want to hear more about landlord and tenant matters.